I did my PhD at Imperial, as Martin said, at Silwood Park, and then stayed on for a postdoc. I then went to Oxford for a temporary lectureship, but I came back to Imperial 3 years later. And I spent the next 20 years at Imperial on the faculty it kept changing its name, but it ended up as the Department of Biology. And I ended up head of biology. And I also had the privilege of being director of the NERC Centre for Population Biology, which was based out at Silwood Park. And my current role in Oxford, I'm Professor of Population Biology, but I'm also director of something called the Oxford Martin School, which is a curious part of the university. We're very privileged to have an endowment. So having spent most of my career trying to raise research funds, and part of my job at the moment is to give out research funds intramurally within the university. So I used to say I joke. Actually, I don't joke. I have about the nicest job in Oxford University. I have a license to stick my nose into anything, including three-dimensional printing of brain cells, which is not my own research at all. It's some very talented people we have here. And again, as Martin said, most of my career, especially when I was at Imperial, was based around population biology. I have a particular interest in both population dynamics and evolutionary biology, and doing a mixture of theoretical modeling and running experiments, both in a lab and then doing field work. And I guess it was towards the end of my time at Imperial, and when I moved to Oxford in 2006, I began to get more and more involved in issues around food security and food sustainability. I'd always been interested in applied population biology and how one might use population biological principles to assist in the control of, for example, agricultural pests or the vectors that transmit disease. But I got more involved in these broader issues around food and food systems and global food patterns, and had the privilege of leading a Government Office of Science foresight program. It was then called, on the future of food and farming, and that really got me into this area, which I sort of remained very much interested for the last 15 years. And I continue to do quite a bit with science advice to government. I stepped down recently from chairing DEFRA. Those of you who aren't Brits, that's our Environment and Food and Agriculture Ministry, chairing their Science Advisory Council. So what I'm going to talk about over the next 20-25 minutes is it's going to be really quite a high level discussion of issues around feeding 10 billion people sustainably. About a third of the talk, the first 5 minutes or so, is to outline some of the challenges ahead. And we do have major challenges ahead, but I want to be really optimistic. These are challenges that we can do. And in the second part of the talk, I will talk about what I think we need to do to have a food system that is not only sustainable, but also feeds us healthily and also provides livelihoods for the huge number of people who depend on the food system for their wages. Now, as I said, I'm a population biologist, and I tell my students in my mid-60s, as I am now, I am more optimistic. I was doing my PhD at Silwood Park all those years ago. And the reason is that until recently, until the last few decades, I don't think there was an intellectually honest argument against Malthus. Thomas Malthus, the late 18th century, one of the founders of modern economics. And Malthus famously argued that population growth rate was geometric or exponential, whereas our ability to feed populations increased arithmetically, being determined essentially by the area of land for farming. And Malthus himself predicted all sorts of horrible things happening in the early 19th century, and we avoided that because of the Industrial Revolution. I'm old enough to remember the next sort of paroxysm of Malthusian pessimism in the late 70s, early 80s, the time of the population bomb, the Club of Rome. And we avoided, and they were making predictions that there would be widespread famine, even in high-income countries, by the end of the 20th century. And we avoided that because of the Green Revolution. But what has become apparent only in the last few decades is that the world is going through a demographic transition. If we bring people out of poverty, a good thing. If we provide access to education, especially for girls, a good thing. If we provide access for reproductive healthcare, most people would agree, a good thing. Then natural fertility goes down, natural fecundity goes down, the so-called demographic transition. The slides in front of you show UN projections for future populations. Those aren't standard errors. Those are an ensemble of projections. But the middle one is what's most likely to happen. And we've already probably gone through peak children, and it looks like that the replacement level will occur in the next couple of decades. The reason why populations will continue to increase most of this century is largely because we're living longer, which is a good thing. So to me, that is a hugely optimistic scenario. And again, especially for me as a population biologist, it really does affect the way I think today. Now, it's not completely rosy. So one of the things that drives the demographic transition, and it's a good thing, people come out of poverty. But, whoops, sorry, I am just, that worked. Forgive me, I failed to change the slide for a second. As people become richer, they demand a better diet. And here I've plotted meat consumption per person against GDP. And you see as GDP goes up, per capita meat consumption increases. Why does this matter? Well, meat is an indirect way of eating sunlight. So when you eat a vegetable, you're eating sunlight at once removed. When you're eating meat, you're eating it at 2 times removed. It's higher in the trophic pyramid. Its energy is lost as you go through. So you need more resources to produce meat than you do plant-based food. And so as people demand more food, then, as people demand better food, then the total amount of resources required to produce that food will go up. And if we look ahead, then most analysis, including those we've done at Oxford, predict that this century we will need between 30 and 60% more food than we produce at the moment. And although that sounds a lot, it's actually still very encouraging. It is something that we're able to do. Continuing on some bad news aspects, then what I didn't know when I was a PhD all those eons ago at Silwood Park was about climate change. It was only just coming on the radar there. And what we know, and we are already beginning to see it in a way that is alarming my physicist friends, is we're seeing the effects of climate change happening now, and we're seeing the fact that they are beginning to affect agricultural production. So we will both need to produce more food, and we will need to produce it in more challenging circumstances. But not only does climate change affect food production, how we produce food affects climate change. So this is a thought experiment done by my colleague Mike Clark here at Oxford. And what Mike asked is, what would happen if we solved all the greenhouse gas emissions from all other sectors of the economy globally apart from food? So we've decarbonized carbon, we've transport, we've decarbonized home heating, we've decarbonized everything except for food. And we assume food, the way we produce food, in the face of increasing demand between 30 and 60%, we assume that that just continues business as usual. And that histogram that you can see on the slide there is the cumulative amount of CO2 that will be released into the atmosphere this century. And the lines on the right show the probability of going through the 1.5 and 2.0 centigrade global heating thresholds as a function of that amount of carbon going into the atmosphere. And the message here is that if we do nothing about the food system, we will without doubt go through 1.5 just through the food system, and we will be pushing towards going through 2 degrees. And I stress this is just the food system. This is a thought experiment. It's not something that will happen. And the message here to me is absolutely clear. Continuing with the food system as it exists at the moment, as it exists business as usual, is just not tenable. If we want to do something about climate change, if we want to have sustainable food production and the world to live within its environmental limits. Now, let me switch from some worrying news to something which is sort of largely good news. And many of you will be aware of the Millennium Development Goals that were set in the late 80s to run from 1990 to 2015. And there were a whole series of Millennium Development Goals, one of which was to halve malnourishment. And I think it was the only one of the Millennium Development Goals that was met. So again, we should look where there has been good news. And if you look over the last 50 years, we have made very substantial progress in reducing global malnutrition and hunger. Now, of course, many of you will have guessed that one of the main reasons for that is the economic miracle that has been China. I'm old enough to remember when literally millions of people were dying in China because of actually politically induced famines, and that does not exist anymore. So we have good news, a sort of relatively linear reduction in malnutrition. And I say relatively good news because in the last few years, that has been reversed. The inset horizontal histogram are the number of people, sorry, I left the scale out there, that should be million, in very severe hunger. These are the people who, we see it in our television screens, suffering, for example, at the moment in South Sudan. So we have seen that reversed. And if I just show you the next slide, don't worry about the details of this, but this shows you where the major hunger hotspots are. This is from the wonderful organization, the World Food Programme, that every quarter does an early warning hunger hotspots. And you can see that the majority of hunger hotspots are where there is civil or international conflict. Not all, but the vast majority is where there are problems. And of course, then this leads to an interesting question is when is a problem of hunger part of the food system that can be changed by, for example, interventions in agriculture and consumption, some of the other things I'll be talking about later, and when is it a geopolitical problem? When is it a problem outside the food system? And then just looking at another, moving from low-income countries to high-income countries, then we have the issue of overconsumption. Again, something that really was had much less salience even 30 years ago. Those are relatively recent UK data on overweight and obesity. The overweight figures in the UK and also in other high-income countries are largely beginning to asymptote, but obesity isn't. And certainly there's some very worrying projections that if you take those patterns of increasing obesity and you work out what that will mean for, in the UK, the National Health Service, but essentially any other health services, it is going to be a quite enormous drain in health services going ahead. And then finally, just a note about food prices. This is a food price index that the FAO runs, and it's run it since 1990. But actually, if you extrapolate it back all the way to the oil crisis, the 1970s, from the 70s to around 2005, food prices were relatively constant. But in the last 20 years or so, we've seen this real volatility in food prices. The initial one around 2010 may have had something to do with the financial crisis. The most recent one clearly had something to do with Ukraine and to a lesser degree, the pandemic. But it shows that we have recently entered a period of food price volatility that we haven't had for 40 or so years. And it has brought food right up the political agenda. So just to summarize the first part of the talk, there will be continuing demand for food, probably peaking around those values by mid-century. We cannot avoid the environmental impact of food. We have to think about the diseases of both overconsumption and underconsumption. And almost certainly we're going to get more frequent shocks. The science clearly says that for climate change. Most political scientists suspect it for geopolitical, and we just don't know about pandemics. Okay, so what can we do about it? So I'm going to canter through 4 things. You can sort of cut this cake in many different ways, but I like to do it like this. So modify diets. Well, why do we need to modify diets? What I've done here, and what particular food should we look at? What I've done here is I've taken all the current emissions from the greenhouse gas emissions from global agriculture and scaled them to 100, and then looked at the different components that contribute to that. And staple crops make some component. By far and away, the most important contributor is animal source foods, meat and dairy. And other dairy products. It is a sad truth that if we are going to hit net zero, if we are going to seriously attempt to do climate change, then we, and especially in the rich world, but also in middle income countries, we're going to have to end up eating less meat and dairy. Now, there are some good components about this, that there are co-benefits between eating less of some foods and health benefits. This is a sort of spider diagram, as it's called, where a number of metrics are put around a circle. On the left, health metrics, on the right, environment metrics. And the further you are from the center, the worse that particular food type is. So if you look in the top of unprocessed red meat, you'll see that unprocessed red meat does pretty badly on both health and environment. Well, it does very badly, let me not mince words. In all the different dimensions of both health and environment, it does poorly. Vegetables are the reverse. Vegetables are both good for health and pretty good for environment. Nuts is interesting. Nuts is pretty good for health, but with one exception, and not that bad for the environment, though it's very, very water intensive, hence the spike at 1 o'clock. And then SSBs, for those of you who don't know, SSBs is sugar-sweetened beverages. So that's the Cokes and the things like that. The sugar-sweetened beverages, actually, they're not bad on the environment. Sugar isn't too bad a crop. It's pretty awful on all aspects of health. My good colleague here, Susan Jebb, who's one of the UK's foremost nutritionists, likes to joke that drinking sugar-sweetened beverages is the most environmentally friendly way of ruining your health. And this is what that I'm showing you here by Mike Clark, who I showed you before at Oxford, pointing out that there are some really quite good win-wins in diet change. How does one actually do diet change? Well, we've done a lot of work here on sort of different types of nudges and education. We've shown that if you provide the consumer information about what they're eating, both the health and the environmental consequences, it does make some changes. But the sad thing is it doesn't make a huge amount of changes. It doesn't make, it tends to work for people who are already committed. It doesn't tend to work for people who are not particularly committed, and it doesn't produce the effects at scale that is required. And this is a great disappointment, particularly to government. Government loves nudge and it loves education because it stops them having to do the hard yards, the alternatives, which are largely fiscal and regulatory. Here is a thought experiment done by my colleague here, Marco Springman. And Marco said, and I do stress this is a thought experiment, what happens if we actually tax food in proportion to their greenhouse gas effects? And we do that in the rich world and middle income worlds. We don't do this in the poor worlds, obviously. And if you did that, then you would increase the price of things such as beef, oils, milk, lamb, and it'd do very little for vegetables or sugar and things like that. Now, if you increase the price, then there will be a consumption response. I'm sure we have some economists on the call, and again, you'll immediately be saying, well, what's the elasticity? And elasticity means that a 40% increase in beef prices results in an approximately 15% decrease in consumption. And so you can do this, and I stress this as a thought experiment, and you can do it in different ways. You can do it by taxing some of the worst emitting foods and actually subsidizing the better ones, were you to want to. But if you were to do this, and as I said, do it for the rich world and middle income countries, then you do get an interesting answer. First of all, you get 1 gigaton of CO2 per annum less going into the atmosphere. And that's a number that doesn't mean much to me, but to sort of anchor it, that's about 10% of what we would need to do to keep the environment below 2 degrees. So it's not everything one would need to do, but it's really quite a substantial contribution to that. So that's the environmental benefit. The health benefit is that you would have 500,000 fewer diet-related deaths a year, avoided deaths. So again, I think we will have to have some difficult conversations going ahead about taking harder action on the food system, such as taxes. And then just very briefly, I'll mention those of you in the UK, George Osborne, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, announced a UK soft drink industry levy, in which industry was going to be penalized for the very sugary beverages that they produce. Now, I have to say that when it came out, I thought it was the wrong way of doing it, as did most of my colleagues in Oxford. We said it should be more consumer focused rather than industry focused. And we did not realize quite what industry would do to reduce the sugar content of its products in order to avoid the penalty. And it was really successful. So it was announced in March 2016. It only came in April 2018. And you can see the squeeze on the high levy sugar sweetened beverages. That was caused by industry changing their product formulation. And we've done quite a bit of work in Oxford on the societal benefits of that, although I'm quoting some other work which came out in July, which showed that simple intervention had halved the sugar consumption by children. So fiscal interventions can work if society allows politicians to do it. Now, I'll finish by a comment that many food sector companies, and I picked Nestle here, but not particularly, just as an example, most have net zero commitments. And they're saying they're going to achieve net zero by 2050 in Nestle's case. Others have said 2040. And they're beginning now to work out just how to do that, and how to sort of look at what in the jargon is called their scope 3 emissions. So not their direct emissions, but their indirect emissions, both among their customers and their suppliers. And I think one of the things they're looking at in particular is how they can reduce the emissions associated with meat and dairy. And I think that may push a reduction in consumption of those particularly high emitting foods. So let me say a little bit about sustainably increasing food production. There's a lot of really interesting science here, and I'm only going to touch upon it. The two pictures up at the top, the left, many of you will recognize as Bruegel's famous The Harvesters. And look at the size of the wheat compared with the humans. And on the right is a modern wheat crop. We have dwarfed our wheat so that much more energy goes into wheat, and it yields much higher than the crops on the left. I should say that whenever I show this slide to students, and someone always puts up their hand and says, excuse me, how do you know it's not the people who have got smaller? But there was an element of that, but it is a genuine reduction in size. I'm really excited about what modern molecular biology can do to improving crops, including crops that have hitherto been ignored by modern molecular biology. It's really hard to change crops, especially in the past. And so most attention has been on maize, wheat, soy, and rice. But now the techniques are becoming sufficiently usable and transferable that we can, for example, do in some of the crops, the millets, the sorghums, the teffs that are essential for people, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. And there are some really interesting, really quite radical suggestions about how we might improve crops. There's a project that includes many universities. I think Imperial is involved, and Oxford certainly is, which I won't go into details, but essentially means rewiring photosynthesis in rice. It's called the C4 project. Were that to succeed, and it's a big if, then it's really exciting. I'm going to skip over this because I think everyone knows that harnessing data science, new centers, and robotics has an enormous possibility to both increase yields and also to means that when we put fertilizers and agrochemicals on the land, we do it in a far more precise way. I do want to just go off on a very slight tangent and say that I think there's some really fascinating novel strategies for disease and pest management coming down the line. So I'm switching out of agriculture just briefly into disease management. I have since 2001, I've been part of a project that's led out of Imperial College by the fabulous Austin Burt in biology. It's been funded now by the Gates Foundation for 25 years, exploring how one might use modern gene drive to control malaria. It's been a privilege to be involved in this project under Austin's leadership. And although it's concentrated on vectors at the moment, I think there are exciting things that might happen for agriculture as well. And I also wanted to very briefly talk about alternative proteins. I think there's some really interesting ideas there. And Imperial is really leading in the UK on some of the issues around cellular meat. You just got a big injection of funding from the Bezos Foundation. And well, I should say that my group in Oxford, we were associated with one of the competing bids. So I was slightly sorry we didn't get it. But then when I discovered Imperial were the leaders in it, I was, as someone who still has an honorary appointment at Imperial, I was pleased through gritted teeth, if you see what I mean. So I want to come to the end. I'll say a little bit about reducing waste. It's sometimes estimated that 30% of all food is wasted. And this is probably true. Sometimes reducing waste is seen as a get out of jail card. And one has to be realistic about it. Some food waste is pretty much avoidable, and some food waste is a choice that would be very hard to change. But there are some exciting technological interventions that may reduce waste. Just running quickly around the slide of vegetables falling out of a house, that apparently is what an average British household wastes a year. Then there's some tomatoes. They're genetically engineered for longer shelf life. Now, some people would find genetic modification unconscionable. Were you to accept it, then you get tomatoes that last longer. Smart packaging that tells you when you need to eat anything. Where you do get waste, put it into the circular economy. That's a factory in Kenya producing mushrooms off coffee waste. But there are trade-offs. You see on the right, fresh vegetables in plastic. They stay fresh longer because of the plastic, but the plastic produces carbon and requires carbon in its production and leads to microplastics. So there are trade-offs here we need to navigate. Reducing waste is a no-brainer, but don't think it's the only thing that has to be done. So finally, improving food governance. We're really interested in the concept of stress testing the global food system, doing to the food system what we all wish had been done to the banks in the early 2000s. And with my colleague, Jim Hall, and his postdoc, Jim Verschure, we're working on a model of commodity flows between all ports on Earth. So what food is being transported from what to what, so that we can begin to do experiments about, were you to have a blockage here, were you to have a drought there, how the global food system would respond. Now, we're still working this, but I'm going to finish sort of more anecdotally. I suspect most of you will know about the growth of about everywhere. There are more and more big global centers, and that these are concentrated, especially in Asia and especially in Africa. The size of the dots, the squares there, is the size of the city. How bright they are is how rapidly they're growing. So you see in Europe, green, not growing much, growing faster in China and India, but look at sub-Saharan Africa, growing extraordinarily fast. Greater Lagos, Kinshasa, Dar es Salaam. These are enormous cities, and they are on the coast. And it's no coincidence that the biggest ones are on the coast, because they have to be fed through global commodity markets. This data is a little bit old now, but it's still true. This is just for developing countries, so low-income countries would be a better way of putting it. And it's the amount that low-income countries export and import of cereals, and you see the net imports there. So developing countries are major net importers of cereals. And I said at the beginning that I am a medium to long-term optimist about what we can do for the food system. What keeps me awake at night are some short-term issues as well. And again, I showed you this graph beforehand. This is the recent volatility. My worry is that if we got a series of bad luck, a series of bad luck events happening around the same time, it could be a couple of droughts in major bread baskets, could be geopolitical fractures. Then my worry is I am not completely convinced that global commodity trade, the system of global commodity trade, could rewire itself fast enough that we will continue to feed the major cities of the global south. And what I've done here, and this is work done by a group at Boston University, is to sort of focus in on the major period of volatility between 2008, 2012. And those arrows are estimates of civil disturbance, which were correlated with high food prices. The Arab Spring had many drivers, but one was food prices. Were we to get our rewinding of global commodity system wrong, and I really hope this doesn't happen, were Greater Lagos or Kinshasa to suffer really bad famine, we would see outbreaks of civil and economic disjunction and unrest like what we have never seen before. And if you look at some of the tragedies that have been played out, we see them on our television screens over the last few years, then that would be nothing as to what we would be exposed to. Thinking about these issues, to me, is ethically the right thing to do, but it's actually also from a purely selfish perspective, selfish European perspective, it's the right thing to do. But I do stress that I think it's ethically the right thing to do. Now, I don't want to be alarmist. I've been calling for stress testing for some time. A good friend of mine from Cargill's, one of the big commodity systems, said, well, we have been stress tested. because of Ukraine and because of the pandemic. And the global food system has come through relatively well. And so there is good news. If you would have asked me in 2020 how the global food system would have coped with both of those crises, I would have been less sanguine than as actually happened. So there is some good news there, but I still worry about it. I still think we should do the stress testing. So let me conclude. The challenge of feeding 10 billion or so people sustainably, equitably, and healthily is a big challenge. But to me, it's a solvable challenge. I'm optimistic. It needs political bravery. As I've just said, short to medium term, I have worries. And there's much that can be done. You can throw up your hands in despair and say, oh, it's so complex. How do we do it? And things. It is complex, but it's also easy. And it's easy that we just need action on all fronts. All of us just need to get on and do what we can do. And as important, to legitimize our politicians to do things that are difficult. And then my background, I'm a population biologist. I'm an obsessive natural historian and biodiversity person. I mean, I really care about it. You will care about you'll have your own passions. But whatever we care about individually, if we fail on food, we fail on everything. So thank you, Martin. I think I've probably gone on slightly longer than I intended. Yes. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Charles. Super talk and very poignant for all the little ways in which we ourselves in our small way can improve things, as well as lobbying government as much as possible. We have a question from Alan earlier typed in, which goes, to what extent is water supply a limiting factor in food supply in the coming decades? Over to you, Charles.
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is yes, it is, but it's not uniformly a problem. So the thing about, for example, greenhouse gas emissions is it doesn't matter where you emit them. They have the same effect on the environment. The thing about water is it makes, if you use too much water in one place, it has a very different effect from using too much water somewhere else. When I was doing the government report on the future of food and farming, we engaged with the staff college at Shrivenham, whose job is to try and work out where are the likely flashpoints ahead. And I should say this is not confidential at all. It's published analysis. And they saw that one of the most important drivers was shortage of water. One of the reasons we got the Syrian civil war was that because of water shortages, partly caused by climate change, partly caused by increased population, the Syrian government could no longer subsidize its rural communities as much as they had done in the past. And when the subsidies were reduced, it was part of the things that drove the discontent that led into the civil war and the appalling response from Bashir. I worry particularly about Kashmir and the Pakistan-India border. They're a very volatile place, using a lot of groundwater, using water from the Himalayas, the meltwater. They're running out of groundwater. The meltwater pattern is going to change because of climate change. So really important. To me, one of the major research goals, and we have a great group at Oxford does that, Imperial strong in it as well, is working out how to use water better. And that requires both natural science and social science.
Yes, yes, indeed, yes. Thank you. And then another question here is, where are we? Apparently, with 20% of the Amazon now deforested, it did not have its usual monsoon last year, for example, and it's unlikely to this year. So pollination next month is at risk. And given Brazil's standing in the top 3 producers of food, how has that factored into your thinking, Charles?
That's an interesting question. So the problems, I was privileged enough actually to be in the Amazon this May, or the Peruvian Amazon rather than the Brazilian Amazon. What's happening at the moment over the last couple of years has been due to the El Nino, and the wind down from the El Nino has not been standard. So we don't precisely know what's happening at the moment, whether that is something that will go back to what it was before, whether it's a more secular change. So I don't think we quite know what's happening at the moment there. I think we'll just have to wait to see what happens. I think the bigger question, though, is what would happen if we got major change there, and especially if the Amazon dried out and if we then began to get big natural fires. I think the pollination issue is not the one I would worry about most. Mm-hmm. The whole meteorology of South America depends on having this vast rainforest. And if you sort of model what would happen without it, then, for example, large parts of Argentina would turn into a desert. The Bolsonaro government were just simply dreadful about this. And the current Brazilian government is much more positive about addressing some of these issues.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yes, thank you. Then next question is from Cam Kyra. Whoops, I'm losing it. Somebody else comes in. Government intervention can help reducing sugar levels and making food healthier. Is it possible to prepare a list for all food items which can be worked on in future or near future? And can this be implemented globally?
So this is a question about reformulation, I think.
Yes, yes.
So if it's a question about reformulation, then to be fair, then the sugar sweetened beverages are the more straightforward ones to do. As you move into other high sugar type of foods, then you get issues. So what I learned about 10 years ago, mouthfeel, which is what a type of food feels like when it's in your mouth. So it's partly taste, but partly it's physical structure as well. Then you do get problems in reformulating that. Another problem is that quite a few food producing companies have experimented with reformulation. And they find that if they put that into shops, then purchases of that goes down. Now, it turns out it's just because people find it different and switch to alternative brands. And there is evidence to say that whether it's possible to coordinate this across brands, then people would find it a bit odd to begin with, but would very quickly get used to it. So there's an interesting sort of political economy question here. We rightfully try and discourage companies from collaborating with each other, setting prices, for example, antitrust legislation, things like that. But there are positive things that they can do together. And to me, that is a role for the state, for government to intervene. And then we get to the narrative about, is the state a nanny state or not, and whether we as society allow our governments to intervene in the food system. Can anyone hear me? Martin seems to have frozen.
Yes, yes, indeed. All you're doing, release oxygen. Okay, as far as I can see.
Martin, I don't.
Any good now?
Yeah.
Oh, apparently, my internet connection is unstable. I'll try and read that question again. Trees absorb CO2 and release oxygen. What are the other things you think we can do which would be more environmentally friendly for us as lay people?
Sorry. So the question is about trees or about what we can do as individuals?
Did you hear that?
Yes, I'm not certain what the
right, yes
about trees, or is the question about what we do as individuals? I'm sorry, Martin, I've lost you again. So I'm going to continue talking, assuming other people can hear me if Martin can't. Let me first address what I think was the issue about what we could do.
I think in gardens. Yeah. Yes. Oh no, I can now see you.
Okay, Martin, I was
Find that question about planting trees.
Yeah. So I think there were two components to the question. The first is what can we do as individuals? And I think all of us can change our diets. That's the first thing we can do. Let me tell you what I do. So I am not a vegetarian or a vegan, but we certainly try at home to adopt the mantra of less but better when it comes to meat in particular. So to treat meat more as a special a special treat rather than something one would have at every meal. So that within the food system, that is something I think one can do relatively easily, and there is a lot of information available for that. I would also say that all of us as individuals citizens, I think should engage in debates about this. There are a lot of vested interests in this world, and I think the more that civil society can act to try and encourage movement to make politicians braver. I don't normally quote Jean-Claude Juncker, but Juncker said something a couple of years back that I thought was very much resonated with me. He said, often we as politicians know what to do. What we don't know is how to get elected once we've done it. So we as citizens need to make it easier for politicians to take hard decisions.
Yes, indeed, yes. Final question here from Imam K. What role do international trade policies thing in the way place in exacerbating or alleviating food shortages, and how can they be reformed to support global food security?
This is a huge issue and things, and there has been positive moves on this and also negative moves. So if you go back 30 years ago, there was a lot of dumping of produce from excess produce from high income countries, middle income countries that was a major disincentive for agricultural development in low income countries, and that's much better now. The issue that worries me most about, well, let me say two things about trade policy. First of all, what I would like to see is more things put in place to avoid knee-jerk trade restrictions when there is a crisis. And we see it very frequently that countries will forbid exports or put tariffs on export because they're worried about local shortages. In 2008 and 2010 and 2012, where there were two episodes of food price volatility, in the first food price volatility, all the countries of Southeast Asia intervened in the rice market, which led to some major problems, especially in net importers such as Myanmar. And everyone agreed afterwards that this was a bad thing. And under the auspices of the ASEAN Association, they put in place some protocols so that when food price volatility happened again in 2012, this did not happen. And the consequence of that was much fewer instances of food shortages. So things like that are important. It's really complicated at the moment because the WTO is largely dysfunctional, in large part because America won't engage with it. We have some very interesting things happening in the European Union at the moment, who are thinking about how to do carbon taxes and carbon border adjustments. And I think this is wholly good, well, largely good, but one of the perverse outcomes that might happen is something negative for low-income countries. So I think that when one brings in interventions in trade, one has to be very careful about these unexpected consequences.
Yes, 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 indeed. Well, thank you very much. I think we'll draw it to a close there now, Charles, because we're nearly coming up for our hour.